for service. Because those, we're gonna take good care of their property and then return it to them. If it's returned as a complaint and we're gonna tear it all apart as part of the investigation and replace it, then this doesn't specifically apply. In your case, if you're getting the customer's unit back in, you're going to fix it and send it back to them. This does apply, you cannot exclude it. But the requirements are about as simple as you see here. We'll take good care of their stuff. So you don't need a separate procedure for this per se, but should you get the question of, how do you comply with 7.5.10, the answer is, where that is applicable to us is in the service area, see the service procedure. And you might put a line or two in there that says, as we are dealing with the customer's property, we'll make sure that it's identified, protected, safeguarded, and ultimately returned to them. Done. It's that simple. I have not seen the ISO auditors be overly concerned with this, except in the case where they're providing you with significant materials that you would then manufacture. That's pretty rare. Make sense? All right, let's move on. Reservation product. This is detailed in your documentation on how you manufacture the product, from the incoming inspection through production through outgoing. There's protection from alteration, adulteration, contamination, damage, storage, and handling. Now, there's an important aspect to this that needs to be addressed, and it is both in the QSR and ISO. Now, if you look this up in the QSR, the language doesn't jump out at you. Suitable packaging and shipping containers. So yeah, fine, we package it this way and the other way. What proof do you have that it's effective? Now, your situation is different because you're looking at very large items. And I doubt if anybody, I'm not even sure that you can do this testing. We looked into this at one time and I never got a good answer. For smaller items, particularly things that are breakable, you're selling things in glass vials. There is an ASTM test out there, a test standard for shipping and packaging. They do the drop test, they do the vibration test. This testing is designed to replicate the standard shipping process. You'd have a tough time doing that with some of these big tables out there. And as far as I know, I haven't seen anybody request it either. If this comes up, you would say, yeah, this is the way we package, and there is no testing designed to specifically test this type of thing. And I would also point to my complaint data. That does not work for smaller packages. I think it might be work for you. Shelf life does not apply. If it does, then there's lots of controls on that. But that's something you don't have to worry about, fortunately. Right? No shelf life? Control, monitoring, and measuring, also known as calibration. This is a big deal. This is low-hanging fruit for an auditor. I write lots and lots and lots of non-conformances for this. First question, this is not difficult to do, but there's a number of steps to go through. One, what do you have in-house? This is your operation, not your contractors. This would be an audit point for you auditors, but for you guys to control, what do you have in-house that you use for monitoring and measuring? Digital calipers, anything that takes a measurement, thermometers, all kinds of different things. First I should have those on some kind of equipment list. That list should tell me what my routine calibration requirements are. Frequency, how, and who. Now, there are really two options here. There's calibrate in-house with my own people, or there's, for those instruments that I have, let's use digital calipers, so there's probably something you're likely to have. Unlikely I'm going to calibrate those in-house. I'm going to send those out. You could do it, there'd be nothing wrong with doing it in-house, but it requires a lot of equipment, specialized instrumentation and so forth. Probably cheaper to send it out. There's all kinds of calibration vendors that know how to do this and do it well. So, I have to identify the equipment. At what frequency do I calibrate this? There is no prescribed table of frequencies or anything like that. It's based on your experience. What are you using this for? It's a risk decision. Again, how critical is it? If it goes out of calibration, then what? What's the impact of that? So at some frequency, usually annual, sometimes more frequently than that, depending on what we use this for. I send this out, the calibration vendor does their thing, sends it back to me with a certification says it's calibrated. I file that, it's all good. If you do this in-house, then you have multiple other requirements. You have to have a calibration procedure. How do I calibrate this thing? Using what? The standards that I'm calibrating against have to be NBS traceable, which means you have to buy them and they have to be calibrated against something else routinely. The people that conduct this service need to be specifically trained, and that training needs to be documented. So for most people that run smaller operations, my recommendation is don't do this yourself. This is a good one to outsource. It's actually cheaper and you'll be more compliant than if you try to do it in-house. Because if you do it in-house, you've opened the door to all these records. We're going to dig through them. We're going to look at the processes, look at the procedures, we're going to look at training records of the people that do it. How do you manage this? You have an Excel spreadsheet, you have software, there's a number of different, most of these are relational databases. Those have to be validated. Lots of things to pay attention to. Now, regardless of how you do your calibration, it is critically important that somebody looks at those results when they come back, whether it's internal, done internally by your own people, or external. Quick story. This is another Texas. This is at least my Dallas. Running an audit at this facility, they make a device, it's not the LASIK device itself, it's one that's used to actually map the eyeball. It's a laser and it does all kinds of cool stuff. So as I was running their audit, I asked for just arbitrarily a number of calibration records, two of which were the power meter that measures the output of the laser that they are shooting into your eyeball. It brings me they have a calibration vendor, so he brings me the certs from the vendor, and I'm looking at it and says, as found, out of calibration. Okay. Second, as found, out of calibration. So I asked the fellow who was in charge of this, who happened to be the warehouse guy, not a good choice. I said, so what did you do? Oh, deer in the headlights look, he has no clue. He never read the certs. This calibration had been done 3 or 4 months previously, and it's an annual calibration. So for 364 days, potentially, this laser, both of these laser power meters had been out of calibration. They did not know it. They took no action because they're completely unaware of it. Said, okay, folks, you have a choice. Choice A, pick up the phone, call the FDA, tell them that you have no way of knowing whether the lasers that are being pointed into people's eyeballs are within the calibration specs or not, and be prepared to recall everything you've made in the last year, which would have put these guys out of business. Relatively small company, there's no way they would have withstood this kind of recall. Choice B, you better go find yourself a laser physicist who's going to prepare for you a very nice report that says no matter how far out of calibration this laser is, it can't physically produce enough power to cook your eyeball, which is what they ended up doing, fortunately for them. The alternative would have been a massive recall. They would have been out of business. So this calibration process is critically important. If you get a result back that says out of calibration, Your procedure should have very explicit directions on what do you do. You run screaming to QA, say, what do we do now? So investigation, what's the possible impact of this thing being out of calibration? It may be no big deal. It could be a very big deal. Many of these instruments are calibrated on an annual basis. If it's out of calibration, if it's found to be out of calibration, what do you know? Do you have any idea when it went out? None. The only thing you know is that it's the last calibration, it was in date, and sometime between that date and now, it's out. So what could this mean? Hopefully it doesn't mean much. It's not that big a deal. Potentially it could be very serious, could end up in a massive recall and all kinds of ugliness. So this is, a lot of people don't pay that much attention to this process. It's critically important, and I would have in your procedure that when those calibration certs come back from the vendor, someone, I would recommend QA, review them and sign off on them to make sure that somebody's looking at these things. Because as found out is a big deal. Now, the calibrations vendor's job, if they find it to be out of calibration, is to put it back in. Great, from now at this point moving forward, I'm okay, but I don't know anything about the past. So, investigation, risk assessment, what does this mean? Maybe nothing. Let's say you have a torque wrench that's used to put the final torque on something that holds that bed together. If that thing's out of calibration, what does it mean? Could be important, maybe not. Somebody has to make that determination. Does that make sense? So take a look at this procedure. This is an aspect of this that many people don't think about. Is, what is the impact of one of our instruments being out of calibration and not giving us correct values? So do take a look at that. The other requirement is that the equipment that requires calibration is described, is listed, usually done on an equipment list, calibration list, which identifies the instrument down to the specific instrument. Every one of these should have a unique ID. Usually the finance people want that anyway. They'll make you have an asset tag so that they know, what we have and to make sure stuff doesn't walk out the door. If you've got 15 digital calipers, they better all be individually numbered. You have to be able to discriminate among them. The status of that instrument should be noted on the instrument itself. I should be able to go pick up that set of calipers, turn it over, and see the calibration tag on it. It identifies that and tells me when it was calibrated and when it's due next. Failure to have any of those components is a non-conformance. You will be cited. Questions? This is more important than a lot of people think about. Yes, ma'am.
You said on the calibration law you want frequency, how, and who. Is the how? What is the how? The test method, or if it's internal or external?
If it's all external, then you don't need to worry about it. You don't need to cite their test method.
So what do you mean by how then? Is it just internal or external?
You don't even need how unless you do the internal.
Okay.
So how is only applicable, and how is where you would cite the procedure number if you did it internally. If they're all external, don't worry about it. I would suggest that unless you have a metrology group and have a really big need for this, I would recommend you outsource it.
Yeah. And then on the unique identification, can we just use serial number?
That's perfect.
Okay. Instead of putting a asset tag on it.
Most finance departments will force that for their own purposes. Not everything has a serial number though. So if you have...
Right, if it has a serial number, that's what we use. If it doesn't have a serial number, we'll assign a number to it.
That's fine. Assign it, as long as it's unique. Perfect. Doesn't matter how you do it. Serial numbers are great. Instrument number, As long as you can specifically identify that caliber, that's what we're after, or whatever else it might be. Rulers, we talked about that earlier. How about a steel ruler? Calibrated?
It's used to make a quality decision, yes.
You are exactly right. Something as silly as a steel ruler, if it's used for a quality measurement, is calibrated.
Scale.
Pin gauges, calibrated. Okay.
One issue that we found in the last audit was the label. Was illegible.
Illegible, yeah.
Yeah.
But we need to find a way to say.
We learned that it has to be illegible.
Yeah, good point. The whole point of the label is so that the user of the equipment is supposed to check it to make sure it's within calibration. Well, if he or she cannot read it, it's somewhat pointless. Yeah, I'll cite you for that in a heartbeat. Okay, good questions. Software validation we talked about already. As I said, there are a gazillion and 5 ISO standards.
The software, is that also for the machines and robots and things?
That. Yeah, and that would be done as actually in chapter 6.
We do validation on software, robotic software.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to backtrack here and then we'll touch on that. There is an ISO standard on measurement calibration. Like everything else. All right, this would normally take us to 8. We're going to backtrack to 40. All right, resource management is a big hitter. The key thing in here for virtually all companies is training. And then there are some other equipment-specific topics that are covered in here that we'll touch on also. Yeah, we already talked about a number of resources in terms of making sure that's adequate. But establish a procedure for training and competence. Competence got a lot of emphasis in the 2016 version of the standard. Training was the primary focus prior to that. Now they're looking at both aspects of it. And we'll touch on that in a bit. There are some other things before we move on. Effectiveness, we'll talk about assuring competence. How do we do that? We'll have some suggestions on that. Records, we've said 100 times, it's all about the documentation. There is one aspect in this that says personnel are made aware of the importance of their activities. You do that through your training program. That's another reason why I think having some kind of annual regulatory review is also a good idea, although that's not a requirement, but should be. Effectiveness check is based on the risk associated with the activity, and we'll talk about that in a second. All right, there are 5 elements that comprise a good training program. These are important. This is a very easy thing to audit. And of all the non-conformance, of all the audits I do, it is a rare audit that I don't write a non-conformance for some aspect of training. This is simple. It's really not that hard to do, and it makes perfect logical sense. These 5 documents are, they follow one another in a logical sequence, and they make perfect sense. Number 1, my very first element, what does the business require? So if you're going to hire a specific position, what are the business's requirements for that position? You already have that document. It's called the position description. Now, be careful with that document, because what you put in there is what you're held accountable to. This is not the place, and I'll tell you where many companies go wrong, is they let the hiring manager write this. What's the hiring manager going to do? He's going to put his wish list on there. So, gee, I really would like a PhD candidate from MIT. Fine and dandy. But if you put that in the position description, that's better be what you actually hire. So when you say 4-year degree required, and then you go hire cousin Billy Bob, who barely survived the 8th grade, I'm going to write you up. I see it all the time.
But that's why we say preferred on a lot of our job
There
descriptions.
you go. Weasel
So-
words are your
Yeah.
best friend.
Yeah,
So, be very careful with what's an actual requirement and is stated as such, and what is desirable or preferred. I can't audit you against preferred.
right.
I will audit you every day against what you actually put as a requirement. Where this happens predominantly is in education. Once in a while, we'll see it in experience, but it's usually when I see it, it's in education. 4-year degree required is the standard one when they hire someone without it, not performance.
Quick question, would you be able, would you be able to do it in equivalency?
Not unless you put it in the procedure.
So say for instance, they say a bachelor's degree, required or educational equivalency, and most companies do an equivalency 2 years experience for every year of education.
That's fine, as long as it's stated that way. But where you get in trouble is say bachelor's degree required. And then I look at, this has happened a lot.
Can you leave it open or comparable work history and you don't have to put a year? Wouldn't that be
You
better?
you can do it any way you want. Any weasel
As long as you
word,
follow
any weasel word you put in there will work. Where you get yourself in trouble is if you don't allow any flexibility. 4-year degree required, dot. And I'll hold you to that.
it. Or exchange experience 2 years for every,
Weasel word,
yeah.
happy.
Okay.
Now, when you, just to follow that, if you make it that specific, now I'm gonna look at the experience and make sure that those 2 years are met. If they're not, still got you. This does happen. I wrote up a fairly good sized operation down in Houston for this, primarily because the QA manager was so consistent that her records were perfect until I picked 4 of her QA people, none of whom had 4-year degrees, and on the position description was a flat requirement, dot, no exceptions, no weasel words. She's a whole lot more reasonable after that factor of all good bit. So be careful what you put in these position descriptions. Most of the things that are in there are not auditable anyway. Proficient with Word and Excel and CAD, whatever. There's no way for me to make any assessment of that. Education and experience, 5 years experience in or as an electrical engineer. Well, I can audit that one. 5 years experience, a comparable experience. What's comparable? For you to say, I'm not even look. Now, if they are fresh out of school, that's a different deal. But be very careful how you describe these requirements. Allow yourself flexibility. Make sure that somebody reviews these things. Next up, so company is defined what they need. Position description. We hire an individual. Auditor is going to audit that individual, whoever he or she selects, against a requirement. Document, CV, resume. Those, in my opinion, and my advice is, those are your 2 best documents. I can do this from the application, but the application has other stuff on it that you may not wish for me to review. There's questions in there about your felony arrest record, for example. So typically what I'll ask is, position description, I'll pick 4 or 5 people, almost always pick on QA, sometimes and usually design engineers. I'll pick 4 or 5 to bring me the position description and the CV or the resume. If you have that, great. That, in my opinion, that is the best document and easiest document for you to provide.
Quick question on job
Yes, sir.
descriptions.
Yeah.
On our last audit, our ISO auditor made mention of the fact that our job descriptions did not have an approval date, effective date, and approved by. Any requirement?
Nope, making stuff up. No such requirement. There is in clinical, but not manufacturing. A lot of people, it's good practice to have the individual who is hired sign and date that job description. The reason that that is good practice, it's the way to document that they know what their requirements are. It's not a requirement, but it is good practice. It is a requirement in clinical, but not for medical.
So if that was something that was noted, would that not, that shouldn't have been listed as a non-conforming? So
Shouldn't.
It wasn't a non-conformance, but it's something I'll push back on.
He could list, as long as he didn't list it as non-conformance, I'd let it go. If it's an OFI, fine. It's not bad practice, it's not a requirement, he should not cite you for it as non-conforming.
We didn't mean a non-conformance.
Good. And you shouldn't have. Good. I've had, the CVs, by the way, are not confidential. I've had one HR department refuse to give them to me. I said, that's fine, here's your major nonconformance. They showed up 6 hours later, redacted, which I thought was ridiculous. If you do understand, I can probably find every single one of these on monster.com. You know, that ended the discussion. They are not confidential documents. That's one of the reasons we want to use these and not some other things that you might have. These are innocuous. Resumes all over the place. So position description, fine. CV, fine. Here they are. Do they match? Perfect. I'm a happy camper. That's the easy part. Next part, not so easy. Now this is recommendation. My recommendation would be by position, not individual, but by position, establish what your internal training requirements are. Start with your procedures, however many you may have. For, let's pick on QA, so usually do. QA should be trained to the following procedures. This is a matrix. Here's my procedures on one axis and my positions on the other. You can do this by person if you choose. I wouldn't, because I have a hard time having any rationale of why one person in a position is different from another person in the same position. Positions differ one to another, but individuals within a given position do just make your life more difficult than it needs to be. So by position, starting with what procedures should they be trained on? In my opinion, everybody should be trained to the quality manual. Everybody should be trained to document control, change control. Over and above that, and that's not regulatory, that's my opinion. Over and above that, you evaluate what these folks need to know. Who does complaint? The one we frequently get is complaint handling. Who's involved in that? Customer service frequently. Make sure customer service is trained in the complaint procedure. Complaint procedure is another good one for everybody to be trained on. It kind of depends how many people you have. So you determine who needs to be trained to what. There are no specific regulatory requirements. The sole exception really is kind of a quality policy. Everybody ought to be trained to that. But there really are no specific requirements. It's your call. What makes sense for your business? So that establishes what is to be trained. Then you have the corresponding record. This is by individual. So if I'm in this position, matrix said I'm supposed to be trained to these 25 procedures, have I been trained? Now, frequently that's a work in progress, and from an audit perspective, that's okay. No one expects, particularly for a new company, it never happens, that all this is done. So if you've got a matrix that says, you know, we're training, this position is to train to these procedures, these work instructions, any other documentation you may have, and you have records that show at least some of that training has been done, other aspects of it is in progress, shouldn't have any problems. If you've got a matrix that's 2 years old and no training has been documented, that's a problem. Now, the question I frequently get is, we've got employees here who've been here for 35 years, and you know, we don't have a CV, there's no such thing as a job description. Nobody ever put together this matrix, and I have no training records, yet they've been doing this job for 30 years. Grandfather clause. Write yourself a short document in your training file listing the specific employees who have been here for however many years, and their employment predates the training procedures and process. Their competence is established separately. That's a different animal, which we'll talk about in just a second. But where that you have really two choices. You can go ahead and train them, create this documentation, or you can create a document, say, yeah, we know about these guys have been here forever, and, we know they know how to do the job. Larger companies, sometimes they've got, a lot of employees that have been there since day one. It's fine. Not had any issues with that. Make sense? Anybody have any other experience that's different? Okay, so now have 4 pairs.
Temps, temporary employees.
Temps are a different animal. Great question. My recommendation would be very careful about using temps in production. You can do it, but they need to be trained, and that training has to be documented. The training requirement may take more time than the time the temp is going to be there. So if you use temps, and this will be a focus for all auditors, particularly FDA, they're all over temps. If you use temps in production, I would double check those records. They're almost certain to be requested. As soon as FDA finds that you're using temps in production, they're gonna focus on that like a laser beam. The other thing to watch for, particularly from an FDA perspective, do you run just one shift? Not a problem then. If you're auditing places and they run multiple shifts, look at the supervision on the off shift. Frequently, they use undertrained people. It's hard to get people to work second shift. Second shift is not fun. So that's a good one to check if you're looking at records. You'll see people who are not trained per their own requirements run second shift or third. So we looked at four documents, 2 pairs. Position description, CV, that corresponds to it. Position-specific training matrix, training records. What's the 5th one? Documented evidence of training effectiveness. Some of you are old enough to remember the good old days when, as a new hire, they would park you in the conference room with 3 fat binders of procedures and say, commence reading. And you are now trained. How effective is that? Anybody make it past the 5th procedure without falling asleep? I don't think I ever did. Usually it's the 3rd one. Extremely ineffective. FDA and ISO both recognize that it's extremely ineffective and now want some documented measure of training effectiveness. What is that? Whatever you think it ought to be. In my opinion, quizzes are the easiest and best way to document procedural training. Doesn't work well at all for skills training, but it's great for procedural training. Were you awake? Yes. And did you get the basic concepts in this procedure that we trained you? Yes, I have a record, I have a quiz, I have your name and date on it, I've got documented effectiveness of training. Now, this is not exactly the same thing as competence, but they do overlap a bit. For skills training, quizzes are maybe not the best way to do it. For skills training, welding, what have you, observation. Have the supervisor or whomever observe them doing it. A quick paragraph. I watched new employee Joe Newhire do this. He performed it appropriately. We inspected the part, it met specification. He is trained, signed, dated, done.
I think checklists are good in those cases too for observation, and they
That
both
works very
sign.
well, too. Checklists are particularly effective if they standardize
Yeah.
what different people are going to look at. So yeah, where you have that situation, that's an excellent suggestion. So for however you elect to do it, these records are required, they are an expectation, and they will be reviewed by any competent auditor. So expect it. Competence.
Can I ask you a question on
Yes.
your quizzes?
Uh-huh.
So let's say we have a quiz. That
Yes.
has to be a controlled document, is that correct?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
Now, I'm glad you brought that up to remind me something I forgot to say. Let's say you do quizzes for documents. Let's pass it.
Well, you have to set that criteria.
Exactly right. So if you're going to use quizzes, make sure that you give some thought to what's my acceptance criteria. And I've seen it all over the board. You can make it 100%. If you do that, when I used to work in clinical, we had, our quizzes were online and we had to score 100%, but we could take the quiz multiple times. I think, well, that's kind of silly. Not really, because if you have to take the quiz multiple times, you're reading the procedure multiple times, you're actually probably better trained. That is one way to do it. The way that most people that I see, they establish an 80% pass rate. So if you do quizzes, and again, I think that's the quickest, easiest, most effective way to document procedure training, set what pass is. 50%, probably not. 70, 80 is more of the standard norm. 85, yeah, nobody's gonna raise any eyebrows at that either.
Okay, and why are you saying that the quiz, which establishes whether or not they understand the procedure, does not have to be controlled?
Because you can change that quiz at will. That quiz is not a controlled document. I make them up. You'll have one tomorrow, or you'll have one Thursday, Friday, on the audio training. So the quiz itself, you could make it a controlled document if you chose to, but no, there's no regulatory expectation that you do. There'd be nothing wrong with doing it, but I wouldn't cite you if you don't.
And then every time you change, like you say, you have to go through.
If you make it a controlled document, you've got to do the change control process. If
Well,
you-
I understand that, I just needed to understand the justification as to why it does not have to be controlled.
What you're trying to do with the quiz is document that the trainee was awake and got a basic understanding. And I change those questions routinely. And now I would not put myself through the burden of going through change control to do that. To date, there's no expectation of that. Good question.
So in that case, let's say we have a procedure for the floor, and the procedure is not of every scenario that the floor can experience.
Okay.
What if we have a separate training PowerPoint document that is something that we also train to, but the SOP is the actual procedure process for how you do it.
Right.
But this actually gives more detail as to the different scenarios that you may run into, and if you do run into these scenarios, this is how you would accomplish that. Does that document have to be? It's like a training aid. It's like an aid back up to the SOP. Would that need to be controlled?
Not necessarily, unless you created that requirement specifically in your own process. For example, we have a procedure on unique device identification. Absolutely change control. I have a PowerPoint training module on the same topic, not change control. Unless I put in my own documentation that our training materials were controlled documents and require change control, and I would not choose to do that. There'd be no expectation that the training materials themselves are change control. Nobody would expect that, at least not my experience today. You want the flexibility to tweak them to your audience, for example. Good question. Competence. Up to this point, we've been talking about particularly new hires and then training people to procedures. Do you have to retrain every time you tweak a procedure? Depends.
Depends on what the tweak was.
It depends on it's a judgment call, and the way we handle this in our change control process, we have a checkbox. Training required, yes, no. So my advice would be major changes to the procedure, yes. We found something was confusing, we changed the language, we really didn't change the procedure in any dramatic fashion, no. Your call, judgment call, but needs to be justified. Competence. Competence needs to be established, and you'll hear me talk more about this in auditing, because it's a specific point in the ISO standard. But competence in All your positions got additional focus in the new ISO standard. So how do you do that? Any way you want. All kinds of different, it's very similar to the training effectiveness, and in some cases the two could overlap. The one thing that I would recommend that you do not do, which I've seen several times, is the annual performance review, as I talked about earlier. We would not put that on the plate, even though competence in your job is typically reviewed, is addressed. I would not put that performance appraisal on the plate for both the FDA and your auditor for the reasons I talked about earlier. Measure it any other way you want. There's lots of great ways to do that. When I used to run a lab, I would submit to them blind test samples, which was finished product that I had adulterated, and it better fail, or somebody was going to be looking for a new job. So there's all kinds of different ways to do this. Your supervisors that manage the department can come up with all kinds of ways. In auditing, we have one way that works pretty well. Lots of ways to do this. Don't put the annual performance review on the table. Okay, so that's training. 5 key elements, the documentation that matches them, effectiveness and competence. Effectiveness and competence are kind of like twin brothers. All right, the rest of chapter 6 gets into detail about infrastructure and the equipment and the work environment. Work environment we touched on, we'll just very briefly go over that in just a sec. Adequate facilities, obviously depends on what you're doing. If you've outsourced manufacturing, then facilities basically conducive to the work that's being done, however you choose to do it. And if you are not manufacturing, there's going to be almost no attention to this. Nobody cares how you have your office environment set up. No auditor is going to spend any time on that. There's nothing for them to get their teeth into. When you're manufacturing, that's different. If you're not, then we move on to other things. Process equipment, which we'll touch on more in a second. Make sure equipment is identified, tagged, which means ID numbers on it, physically on it. We're going to use those to look at the PM schedule, equipment maintenance records, elevation, all kinds of things. Maintenance activity on equipment. R&D is not covered under the regulatory umbrella. So if you have R&D and product development, have a good understanding for yourself, where's the line between the two? Typically, it's at the point that we get through the very early work and now we have a design and we're going to work toward that. Now we cross that line into product development. If we're still doing proof of concept and evaluating 4, 5, 6 different possibilities, R&D. But if you have both operations going on, give some thought to at what point do we cross out of R&D, which is not regulated, into product development, which is regulated, and in the equipment that might be associated with that. Maintenance intervals sounds a lot like calibration because it is. How often do we maintain? Who does it? By what procedures? How is it controlled? Excel, perhaps, relational databases, validated. Everybody understand the difference when talking about Excel between validation and verification? You can't validate Excel. You don't have the source code. Microsoft's not going to give you the source code. You can't validate. What you can is verify. When do you have to do that? When you're using Excel to do chain calculations, for example, or you have written macros. If you're using Excel as a flat file that just lists, here's equipment 1, 2, 3, and we do it at 3 months, we do it at 6 months, we do it at 9 months. It's just a flat file. There's no background computation going on. Don't have to worry about it. If you're writing macros for Excel or any other program, those things you do verify. How do you do that? You do the same calculation on your calculator, your watch, whatever. Get the same number, document that, you're covered. Make sense? So if you get an auditor ask you for validation of Excel, look at them funny. Because they don't understand, what they just asked. Okay, work environment, you should have a procedure, as I mentioned earlier. Define what requirements you may have or don't have, for the physical work environment. In your case, as I mentioned, you maintain the environment for employee comfort. Done. No clean rooms, no sterile, no temperature controls. In your case, no doubt it's not applicable, but make sure you think about the warehouse. If you've got a product store, the product has temperature requirements, then you absolutely have requirements, and I would expect you to have, as we spoke of earlier, I would expect you to have the ability to monitor that. Personal hygiene, clothing, health, not a requirement for an office environment. There are requirements for manufacturing. Can you waltz into the manufacturing facility in street clothes? Maybe, maybe not. ESD, electrostatic discharge. That is an environmental control. So you would not say that none of this qualifies, yet you have ESD controls. That may be your only control, but that is an environmental control. Gowning requirements, special shoes, any of those things get discussed in this area, in this work environment procedure. The regulation talks about having a separate area for eating. Having lunch out on the production floor is frowned upon. So make sure that you make mention of that. Smoking is pretty much banned everywhere. I've seen that for a long time. Obviously not appropriate on the production floor. And here's your temp training. Temp training, if it applies, is always going to get attention. Control of contaminated products such as returns. We talked about this earlier, or damage. The focus there is segregation, identification, and control. These are good things to have physical security on. If you're getting damaged product coming back in, you want to make sure it does not go out the door, intentionally or unintentionally. Sterile devices we don't have to worry about. Clean room, those two ISO citations there for clean rooms. Don't need to worry about that, unfortunately. That's a whole other can of worms. Lots of fun. Let's go through chapter 7 again. It was so much fun. It's not. Hang in there. All right, chapter 8. Chapter 8 has got a couple of really important elements in it that are always on every audit. FDA does this thing called QSID. QSID is an abbreviated audit process where they pick the more significant elements. Several of these are always on it. They always look at this. Those two are complaints and CAPA. Number 1, number 2 topic for warning letters, as I mentioned. So, measurement, analysis, improvement to achieve and demonstrate and document product conformity. Product meets its specifications, otherwise we would not have shipped it. Ensure conformity to QMS. What's my basic process for that? Quality audit. Quality audit lives in chapter 8. Maintain effectiveness. That's quality audit and management review. Statistical techniques we touched on earlier. This is analysis of applicable data, tracked, trended as you deem appropriate, and then that information uploaded to management review. So these are in discrete elements of the standard. 8.2.1, feedback. Now, feedback can be a pretty broad term. The majority, for most companies, the primary feedback mechanism is the complaint system. Some companies have other mechanisms in addition to that. Maybe you've got a customer suggestion program. That could qualify as feedback. You're required to have that? No. You are required to have a complaint process. You may have some of these other things at your option. If you do, good for you. This can be whatever you find useful. Document your methods for monitoring. It's defined for you in your complaint process. Post-production, there's a special procedure for that, and we'll touch on that. Post-market surveillance is also the second key in feedback. That's you looking at what's going on in the real world. One thing to look at, this is a 2016 enhancement. There are at least three, I can think of a couple others, but you want to build an interface in your procedure, in your complaint procedure, in your post-market surveillance procedure. Now, you're exempt on the FDA side, but you're not exempt from the EU side for post-market surveillance. And for your CAPA procedure, those are the big three. The others come to mind, I think of it. Look at your procedure, and the next time you update any of these three, put in a brief description of the interface between the information coming out of these procedures being reviewed to determine if your risk management analyses may need to be updated. Currently, in your risk management procedure, detail at least these three processes saying CAPA, complaints, post-market surveillance data will be reviewed usually on an annual basis, because that's already established in these other procedures, to determine if I need to make some additional input to my risk management procedure, to this process. So make these point to each other. They are not auditing for this yet. The 2016 standard is just now going into effect for many companies. It depends on the timing of your ISO cert, when you come up with your surveillance, and all kinds of stuff. Some companies are being audited against 2016. This is a 2016 deal. It's not high on the auditor's list yet. It will be proactive. The next time you get an opportunity to tweak any of these procedures, put this acknowledgement of this linkage between these procedures and risk management back to these procedures in there. At some point, they're going to start looking for it. Let's see. Cover that one.
On the customer feedback, I have in the past had some experience with external auditors of they looked at the complaints and the negative feedback,
Right?
but they would ding you on as an observation of you're not balancing that by looking at the positive feedback and sharing that with your employees.
My question to them would be exactly what positive feedback are you referencing? Now, the one thing that you can trot out is your post-market surveillance program. So I'd say that is our avenue for looking at what's going on in the real world. Most companies, what positive feedback? People are very happy to complain, and if you get, attaboy letters, good for you. There's no regulatory requirement to share that. Now, if they signed you as a non-conformance, I'd push back.
Yeah, it was just an observation. They just felt as customer feedback and employee communication that if you are getting any positive feedback, that it should be something you share.
And as they come up with lots of opinions, and so long as it's expressed as an opinion or even an OFI, opportunity for improvement, I'm not going to push back. They cite me for that as a non-conformance. Now we're going to have a discussion. That is their opinion. It's not bad practice. There is no such requirement.
Okay.
But yeah, if you get that information, yeah, great, share it. I'm not going to ding you for it if you don't.
Okay.
Good question. Complaint handling. One of the big boys. several things that are on the auditors, both of them, top plate. One is that you do this process properly, and we'll discuss more about that in a second. But one of them is timeliness. So if you get feedback in the form of a customer complaint, what's the time frame? How fast do you have to react? What's it say in the regulation? Doesn't say a thing. It says timely. What's timely? Reasonable. 6 months is not timely, but no one's holding a stopwatch to this. Now, there are specific timeframes for reporting for serious injury, NDR type stuff. So those have real timeframes, and if you should ever have to do it, make sure you meet them. But in terms of just complaint management, timely complaint handling. So, if we're looking at our complaint process, realize that complaints can come from anyone and anywhere. Most of them come in through one process or another, but they can come to you individually when you're having a drink with somebody and say, you know, my uncle has one of these things and it collapsed on him and hurt his big toe. Is that a complaint?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Are you in?
You can bring one up today while you're talking to us about
I
For
can
your
do
products, you don't get a
anything.
complaint.
Yeah, complaints can come from anybody at any time. So look at your procedure and make sure the procedure acknowledges that. They don't all come through customer service. Or they don't all go through the phone calls to the complaint department. So the procedure needs to recognize that anybody can receive one of these things. And this is why I think complaints need, everybody should be trained on this procedure, at least to know that if I get one, what do? I walk over to the folks, usually customer service, who handles this, and relay this to them so that they can send it down through the channel. So your procedure should acknowledge that happens and establish a pathway to get that information into this process. That's one important aspect. We're going to kind of walk through this process conceptually so that you can look at your procedure and make sure these elements are covered. If you're auditing this, I'm going to cover this again anyway, these are some things you're looking for. Feedback can be both positive and negative. Most negative feedback is probably a complaint, but not always. But all feedback is captured. The initial decision gate here is this a complaint or not? There are two categories. There's complaints and inquiries. I like your product, I'd like to buy 5 more. That is feedback. Is it a complaint? Obviously not. I like your product, it comes in gray, I'd like to see it come in green. Is that a complaint? No. I like your product, I bought it green, it came in gray. Is that a complaint? You betcha. The distinction between inquiries and complaint is that any communication that alleges a non-conformance or missing of a product expectation is a complaint. When in doubt, err on the side of being conservative, consider it a complaint, because as you move through this process, you'll be able to eliminate it later. But this is one thing FDA pays particular attention to. Make sure you don't build in silliness like these other folks that I mentioned, where, hey, if I can't reproduce it, it's an invalid, it's not a complaint. FDA does not agree.
Just have to agree to disagree.
Sorry?
So we just have to agree to disagree.
Yeah, you can do that with your warning letter. So determine if feedback is a complaint. If it is a complaint, it goes through the complaint process. So complaint process, you should have a complaint form, electronic hard copy, however, makes no difference. So one of the things, assign this thing a complaint number. It's not a requirement, but good luck managing this process if you don't do it. Good practice and procedure should say, this is how we assign complaint numbers. This is the rationale for that. My suggestion would be assign these by year. 2017, complaint number 003. The reason being, you don't want to have complaint number 15,035. It looks bad. So if you restart this numbering every year, in my
That's
opinion,
funny.
it's easier to manage.
I know, I'm kidding. I'm making a joke. That's just funny.
Up to you.
No, you're right. No, you're right. That's what we do because it doesn't
So,
look good.
in our system, we
19,000.
start numbering every year.
What's
It also
going
makes it's helpful to manage, because if I see complaint number 2014-008 is still open, the number alone tells me I have a problem. So there's some benefits to that, but not requirements. So I established my complaint, recapitulate the nature of the problem, and be very detailed. Don't summarize to the point where you lose important information. You don't have to quote the person on the phone verbatim, but make sure you capture enough information so that you know what the nature of the complaint actually is, because later you're going to need this. At a bare minimum, make sure you capture the product, the serial number, the complainant, person I call the whiner, and any other product specific information. You're going to need that when you try to move on. So make sure that gets captured. Next step, investigation. Now, investigation has two elements to it that are somewhat related, and you're going to see this in CAPA also. For some complaints, I want to ask myself the question, how extensive might this problem be? If I get a complaint that the bed collapsed on somebody, then yeah, that's on a specific serial number. Have I seen any others? Do I have a trend here? Do I have a bigger problem than just this one complaint? And you'll see this parallel exactly like this in CAPA also. So some consideration over the scope and nature of this thing. Is it isolated? Is it not? If it's not, then we may need to take different and more direct action. So ID the cause and the scope. Frequently, to identify the cause, you're going to have something to evaluate, investigate. Very difficult to investigate product failure if you don't have the product. So, there's that whole process of, gee, I might have to get this thing back in, or I might have to send somebody out. Without that, I don't know how you do any kind of effective investigation to know what the problem is. Many complaints are due to the user not following the directions. So do you get to discount those automatically? Say, it's a stupid user. Read the bloody user manual. Not necessarily. Track and trend those. Isolated, they mean that the user didn't read the manual, and basically it's their fault. When you get a lot of them, it suggests that there might be problems with the user manual itself. These are still important. You don't mark these as invalid. Track and trend this information, and if appropriate, you react to it. If I have 50 customers all asking the same question, and this question is addressed in the user manual, that's important information. It tells me I need to look at what we said because my folks are not understanding it. And we see this all the time. So even though the complaint name is something they did wrong, it's still valid. You may not need to take any corrective action in isolation, but if you start seeing this becoming a trend, then it suggests you may want to take action. So what did you find in your investigation? And from that, what are you going to do? All kinds of different things. From putting product on hold and shutting down lines and going out and all kinds of possible activities, all based on facts. And we said fact-based decision making is a great example. So what did my investigation find? Frequently, the investigation doesn't find a thing. We find nothing wrong with this product. That's reality. It just sometimes happens. So you basically wait for the next one. You definitely want to document at least 3 attempts to contact the complainant and document those. So you want to relay to them what you did, what your investigation found or did not find, and whatever remedial action there might be. So you want to communicate that to them. If you cannot contact them, happens a lot, or they don't give you information. Hey, somebody sent you a complaint, they don't give you the serial number. Now what? Pretty hard to, or you don't even identify the product. Makes it kind of hard to do your investigation, and that's what happens. So your procedure should be specific. Yeah, we'll make 3 attempts to communicate to the individual. If all 3 fail, we'll close it. That's all we can do. When you can, in your investigation, one thing you always want to do is, and make sure it's in the procedure, is review the production information. Go to the DHF. If they allege, hey, this was wrong, and your records show that when you actually manufactured the product, hey, this is one of the things we checked, here's the documentation, it was right. So now we're gonna pursue that discrepancy. Somebody's wrong. Either your records are wrong, or not, or someone's confused. So always make sure that when you can and when it's applicable, that you check the manufacturing records as part of it. It's not the total investigation, but it's an important part of it. Make sense? Okay. Be careful with this one. These always are reviewed. People want to make sure that you take them seriously. This data is tracked and trended. This is one, remember I said there's 10 or 11 bullet items on management review. This is one of them. So this information gets fed back up to management. Reporting to regulatory authorities, this depends on where you are marketing product. The US has a requirement, the Canadians have a different requirement, Europeans have a different requirement. They have separate procedures for each. Because we're real explicit in these things, we even put in the websites as I mentioned. So make sure that you have a procedure that addresses how I report to the applicable regulatory authorities that is in line with where you market. The more explicit you can make these, the better off you are. This is handled by Reg Affairs, usually at a fairly high level. It's not something that most of us have to worry about. Make sure that your time frames are congruent with the requirements. And advisory, for example, you have so many days for a death. You have so many days for a serious injury. You have less time. Actually, even faster than a death is a report of a major malfunction that could be repeated. That I think is 3 days. I have to double check that, but that's a short time frame. And some of the others are longer. So make sure your procedures are in alignment with the various places where you market. If you want to make them different, be my guest. My recommendation is take the shortest, most stringent, make that your standard, then you're always covered. Good practice, assuming you're marketing in the EU and the US, for every complaint, fill out the decision form that says whether or not I need to file. 99.9999%, especially for you, most of the time, the answer is no. But if you fill out the form, sign and date it, now you have documented evidence that you did the evaluation and your conclusion was, no, I do not need to file an NDR, no, I do not need to file with either Health Canada or the EU or anybody else because this complaint did not rise to that level. Here's my analysis, here's why I made the conclusion, sign, date, done. Good practice, not a requirement, but this will keep you out of trouble. If you were supposed to report and didn't, that's not good. I take a very dim view of that. And the FDA always checks. Internal audit. I think we'll talk about this a bit. Wednesday and Thursday. A requirement. you must do it, you must have a program, and we're gonna talk at length about how we do that, so I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time on it here. We already talked about the various ways to finesse this in terms of frequency. Minimum is annual. That now is, being looked at from a risk perspective. Maybe I need to be doing it more frequently than that. I'm gonna leave the rest of that till, much longer discussion. We're gonna get all this CAPA, we're gonna get to it in a second. That's all good. Monitoring measurements process, we have lots of different ways to do that. Product characteristics is all part of chapter 7 in terms of how do I know what product met its requirements, because I got all this test data that says it does. It's part of finished device acceptance. Finished device acceptance, by the way, you're not going to find a whole lot in ISO because that is a country-specific requirement. You should have a procedure, whatever inspection you do, and make sure that's documented. The regulatory requirement is whoever releases that device to distribution and sale, make sure you get that person's signature and date. My suggestion would be that really ought to be QA for your MR, not the warehouse person. Control of non-conforming product. Now, in the little quiz we did, we talked about non-conformances. We have a process for that. It's called CAPA. Non-conforming product is the focus of the regulation, primarily for segregation and identification, which we've kind of already talked about. Make sure that we have good controls to identify non-conforming product, good controls to make sure it's taken out of the production stream, put over here until we decide what we're going to do about it, and then that disposition is recorded, and then we take whatever action is appropriate. The standard makes a distinction between non-conforming product detected before delivery, which would be your non-conforming product procedure. A, something failed an in-process or finished product test. What do we do with it? We change its status to quarantine, we put it over here in the quarantine area, and then somebody evaluates it to determine what we are going to do about it. So that's detected before delivery. They also make a distinction detected after delivery, but they didn't go on to really define what this means. Now, detected after delivery could mean your complaint process. You know, there's a non-conformance, you didn't catch it, it went out the door, the end user found it, generated a complaint, or we had a process for that. There's one situation that I can envision where you detect a non-conformance after delivery, but before it generates a complaint. So in that situation, we'll make sure that you, I think I would just use my complaint process and make sure I advise the user, hey, we found this issue, be advised, service notice or whatever, and take whatever action might be appropriate. This is a new addition where they actually made this distinction between these two, and they probably need to embellish this a bit and really draw the distinction between the complaint process after delivery and found by the customer, and after delivery but not found by the customer. Now what do I do? I'm not aware of any specific requirements around that later yet. It's probably something to see evolve over time. Advisory notices, this is where there has been a problem. This is the European version of our MDR report. So this is how we notify the government, hey, somebody died. Not good. We already touched on rework. For a product that is non-conforming and is going to be reworked, specific requirement has to be done by a documented process, has to be re-evaluated by the original criteria to determine if it is acceptable, documented in disposition. Makes perfect sense. I'm going to rework it, it still has to pass acceptance criteria before it goes out the door. All right, analysis of data. We've already touched on a lot of this. This is my collection statistical massage and whatever I may do, tracking and trending, to upload this information to management review. Feedback, complaints, post-market surveillance, service, installation, all kinds of internal product conformity, first pass, acceptance, non-conformance, rejects, all kinds of manufacturing info, suppliers, results of audits, all of this gets rolled up into management review. If you look at that procedure, you'll see these itemized in it. Improvement, continued suitability of the quality management system. Management review is one of the key processes there. Also a review of your quality procedures, usually on an annual basis. That should be documented. A lot of people miss this one. You should be reviewing your quality management procedures on an annual basis for continued suitability. This is a simple checklist. It's okay as is, or I need to fix it. So the form that we create for this lists all of your procedures on one side and a checkbox on the other that says okay or needs revision. Check the box. I think it's 2 pages long. It's something you can do in probably an hour or two. It's not that difficult. Is this procedure still okay? Or, oh my golly, they updated to 1345/2016, and my risk management or some other procedure, all references 2003. I better fix that. So, is it okay? Yes or no? To be fixed. You don't have to fix it. You just have to identify that it needs to be fixed. Okay, quality objectives, other results, all this we have talked about.
Does that include the ensure effectiveness? Does that include just procedures, or does that include all the way down to the work instruction level as well?
Work instruction level info you're going to get through other metrics. How many products did you disposition as reject, for example? There are other measures to get that information. Good question. Improvement, it's really the same thing, a number of different processes. My quality objectives, my audit results, post-market surveillance, data analysis, all this manipulation of data, and my CAPA system, which we're going to touch on in a second. All that discussed in management review. CAPA, the other big hitter. The purpose of this, remember I said CAPA complaints. The purpose of this is to identify and eliminate the causes of nonconformities to prevent them from happening again. There are 2 aspects to CAPA, we already touched on this. One of them is after the fact. Something happened. There was a nonconformance. I was cited in an audit for some nonconformance. I want to fix it, and more than just fixing it, I want to fix it effectively so it does not happen again. We'll touch on that in just a second. Did I skip one? Okay. I'm going to walk through this in just a second. And then the other aspect is the purely preventative. It hasn't happened yet, but I recognize that it could, so I want to keep it from happening. That's the preventative side. All right, let's see. All right, I'm going to spend just, I'm in good shape. I'll spend a few minutes on how should CAPA actually work. So, take a look at your procedure and see if it roughly follows this process. CAPA, like complaint, has to be very carefully managed. So let's assume, let's take an audit nonconformance. That's probably the easiest one to follow. So if you're cited in an internal audit, external audit, whichever, you actually get a nonconformance. So the expectation is for any audit nonconformance that generates CAPA. OFIs are at your discretion. OFIs, opportunities for improvement, are great opportunities for the preventative side of CAPA. It's not a requirement, won't be cited if you don't do it, but it's an opportunity that I would recommend you take advantage of. Non-conformances, you're screwed up, you're out of compliance, that's guaranteed CAPA. Same is true of complaints. The expectation is that you have a CAPA for every complaint. There are lots of complaints that you're not gonna generate a CAPA for because you already have one. So if you have a complaint, it's recognized, you already have a CAPA for it, you do not have to open another one. If you can't validate the complaint, then that is another justification for not opening the CAPA. What would you fix? You can't identify what was wrong. If you can't identify what's wrong, you obviously can't fix it. So there are good, reasonable justifications for not having a CAPA correspond to a complaint. If you don't, make sure you document that. Document it in your complaint file. No CAPA was initiated to this because we already have one, or we can't reproduce this. We didn't get enough information, we didn't get the product back, we can't do an investigation to determine the cause, no cause, can't fix it. Now, back to CAPA. I'm going to assign the CAPA number, and I'm going to recapitulate in as much detail as I possibly can what the issue was. If we're using a audit nonconformance, I'm going to cut and paste the nonconformance from the audit report directly into the CAPA, including the identification of the audit report. Internal audit 2017, August 2017, nonconformance number 3. It is really important that you tie these things together. Consequently, you do not lump multiple nonconformances in one CAPA. There are some exceptions. You can do that when and only when the root cause is the same, the correction is the same, and the effectiveness check is the same. That is rarely the case. One example, I'm going to write a CAPA because I got my quality management system was not updated in 2016. Therefore, I'm going to update all of it. I would be okay with lumping that, and there are a few other examples. By default, you want your CAPA and your nonconformance to be 1-to-1. If you feel that you can lump them, maybe, but be careful. I see people do this, they put 4 or 5 different issues in one CAPA, and I always ask them, so you have 4 or 5 different root causes, you have 4 or 5 different investigations, you have 4 or 5 corrective actions, how are you going to manage this in one document? Your document's going to be this long, it'll be a nightmare. So, slice and dice these things appropriately. So, we identify the nonconformance. This can be done by anybody. This is my opinion. Who owns the CAPA? The person who has the problem, the process owner. QA's role is coaching and oversight. Unless the problem is in QA, then they own it. But if it's manufacturing, it's manufacturing's problem. If you are QA and you solve their problem for them, do they learn anything?
No.
Are they going to do better next time?
No.
No. Have you accomplished a thing
No.
other than job security? No. So, sorry?
Complete the CAPA.
Yeah. This is my opinion. It's not regulatory. I think you are best served to have the process owner do most of this process. You as QA, though, if that is your role, absolutely have to have oversight. If you let them run amok with this, it will not be done correctly. Who will suffer? The business will suffer, because the FDA will come in and hit you over the head for having a bad CAPA system. So, identify the problem. Assign it. It gets assigned to the process owner. Next step. Like we said for complaints, as part of the investigation, what's the scope of the problem? Is it only this product, or is it all my products? Is it only this serial number? Is it only this issue? How big is it? So you need to ask those questions. It's not really a formal, typically a formal analysis, but you want to ask yourself this question. Is this restricted to just this case, or is it more uniform? Are there other things out there lurking that are gonna bite me? I would like to know what they are. So make sure that you consider that as you go through this process. Next step, it's the rest of the investigation, root cause. Root cause is critical. Why I write a lot of non-conformances, because people do a terrible job of it. Root cause analysis is not the first thing that pops into my mind. What's the first thing people put down as the cause of most problems? Training. Must be training. They did it wrong because they weren't trained. That might be true. A caution, if you put training down as the root cause, be real confident about it, because all of us auditors are going to question you about it, because training is usually put down when I'm too lazy to do the actual root cause analysis. Now, to do a root cause analysis, there are multiple mechanisms, multiple tools you can use. One of the easiest is called 5 Why. If you've never used it, it's very simple. Why did this happen? It happened because Joe wasn't trained. Why was Joe not trained? Well, for this reason. Why there? Ask yourself why about 5 or 6 times. Follow that path. If you do that 5 or so, eventually you get down to what the real problem actually is. That is one mechanism. There are others. There's the Ishikawa fishbone. There's cause and effect. There's lots of different tools out there. The point is, root cause is not the thing that pops first into your mind because it's the easiest. Make sure that in your procedure should make mention of this. I would not document in my procedure that there's only one way to do this. You say an established method such as 5Y or Ishikawa or some other mechanism. Maybe give them some options. But do define in the procedure that you are to use some established method to get there. So, root cause is done properly, documented in the complaint form. Here's my root cause, and here's what we believe the root cause of this problem to be. Described. Perfect. Now, then and only then can I propose a corrective action. If I don't know what the root cause is, this is an audit point. If there's no root cause, then I have no faith at all in the corrective action. I'm going to cite you big time for not doing the root cause, because your corrective action is probably useless. So once I have a root cause, now I can make an informed best guess on what my corrective action ought to be. Now remember who's doing this. This is the process owner. So process owner does root cause. Process owner suggests a corrective action. Are you going to let them go forward and do it? This is where your oversight, coaching takes over. You're going to review that. You're going to approve it before they go execute it. So, did you do the root cause? Yeah, it looks like you did a pretty decent root cause. I see you went through, 5Y or some other mechanism. Here's what you have. Okay? Here's your proposed corrective action. These two are consistent. They make sense. Approved. Go forth. Execute. Don't let them execute without that review. You'll spend a lot of time. Frequently, you'll find out they're chasing down the wrong trail. Waste a lot of time. You might be putting out non-conforming product in the interim. So make sure you do an oversight overview at this point. They execute as agreed upon. That may involve timeframes. Do this by some date. I would like progress reports if it's long term. So you're going to monitor this process. So they execute. Again, QA review. Did you do what we agreed that you said you would do? Yes, you did? Awesome. Wonderful. If you didn't, go back and fix it or do it again or whatever it takes to execute the plan we agreed upon. When I ran regulatory and quality clinical research organization, butted heads with the project managers constantly because they would not follow the plan that they agreed to when they executed these things. Frequently involved sitting down with the CEO and going, you gotta help me with this because I can only beat on these guys so hard. Gotta make this happen. This is a critical process. So they execute. At this point, once they execute the plan, the process owner is pretty much done. Next step is on you, QA, regulatory. The last step in this process is effectiveness. This is the law of unintended consequences. Was our fix effective? If so, how do we know that? This is not an easy thing to do. This is why the process owner not a good choice. This requires QA thinking. How do I know that we fixed it? How do I know that I didn't create some other problem that's actually worse? Lots of different things make good effectiveness checks. For procedural problems, audit citations, a good effectiveness check is the next audit. Hey, we got beat up from this or this audit. We think we fixed it, so the next audit finds it's okay. That's a good effectiveness check. Lots of different effectiveness checks can take a long time. You have a manufacturing issue. Your fix-it said, hey, we're going to fix it, and effectiveness said, we're going to monitor this for the next 6, not lots in your case, but the next 6 products of this we make. Let's say you make this once a quarter. How long is your effectiveness check going to take? 1.5 years. That's okay. So timeliness, when we're talking about timeliness and capital, we're talking about the front end of the process, not the back end. I've seen people write procedures say capital must be closed in 8 weeks. Bad idea. You have no clue how long these will take. You take whatever time they take to be done properly. We can talk some more about this, but that's not an overview. We've got some more detail in there. But that's a pretty good review of the capital process. Those elements in order are really important. Questions? Comments? This is an important one, make sure it works. Okay, let's move on quickly. Talk about that. All right, there is a distinction, and we're not going to dig in on this very deeply. There is a distinction between ISO 1345 and EN. When you see EN, it means the European version of this thing. Wasn't the whole point of having a standard to have one set of rules worldwide? That didn't work very long. The EN version of this thing is identical to the non-EN, with the exception of they added 3 what we call the Z annexes. And what they did in the Z annex is tie 13485 more tightly to the parent directives. There are 3. There's the active and plannable, that's going away by the way, the MDD and the IVDD. These are informational. There's nothing in there that's a must-do, but these are a way to coordinate ISO back to the product. Remember I said at the very beginning of this, the quality is independent of product. This is a way to kind of tie those two things together. It is only appropriate and applicable to the EU. Does not exist in the US. US doesn't follow 13. It's a recognized standard, but it does not replace the QSR in the US. Why? Good question. Essential requirements, if you're in the EU, is I forget how many pages that thing is. It's a beast. Page after page of things that you must do, and every question has to be answered. There's questions in there about radioactivity. Doesn't apply to you. You can't ignore it and say this doesn't apply, we have no radioactive source, etc. This is one of the things they're doing is kind of tying into that document again. Not anything you really need to spend a lot of time. I just want to point out that it does exist, and the reason it exists is to more tightly integrate the quality standard to the product requirements. Conformity assessment, we're not going to dig into this. This is how I get my product on the market in the EU. There's a process for that. It's kind of outside the scope of auditing. The only time you would get into this is if you're auditing a tech file. If the process and the company you are auditing is in Europe, you must have a tech file regardless of class. Even class 1 products have a tech file. If you are auditing against the MDD, Medical device directive, you are expected, i.e. required, to audit the tech file. Now, if you're doing a quality audit, you pick one. If they have 15 of them, you don't have to audit all 15, pick one representative. Does the tech file conform to its requirements? It's not in ISO, by the way. You have to go to the NDB to get that. Let's see, 14971 we'll touch on. There are two versions of that also. I think I've mentioned this. There's ISO 14971 2007, in effect for the US and Canada. There's EN ISO 14971 2012, in effect only in Europe. There are some changes. The two largest ones, in the 2012, the European version, all risks are reduced as far as possible. The US version allows you to set a threshold and say for risks that we identify and classify at this level and below, we don't care. Europeans didn't like that approach, so everything needs to be reduced as far as possible. Who determines what as far as possible is?
You do.
Now, you can't say, I could reduce it further, but it would cost $4 million, even if that's the truth. You would never put that in your document because economic considerations are not to be addressed. So yeah, that's reality. We just wouldn't put that in our, no. This is as far as possible because,
We ain't got $4 million.
sorry?
Because we ain't got $4 million.
Yeah, exactly. There's a point of diminishing returns. Let's see, we don't need to worry about this. This is more MDD specific stuff. This is where it appears. It's in your notes if you should need it. All right, we covered, let's see, I think I might have time for this. Let me take a quick look at this. Let's see what it is. This is yeah, let's spend just a couple minutes on this. Any questions? Y'all have this, right?
Yep.
Good. All right. Identification of nonconformity. So I've been up here clapping my gums about what is required, what is not. Don't worry about the clause number. We are not, I don't expect you to have that memorized. If you don't have the standard in front of you, along with the QSR, there's no way you're going to do that. No documented procedure control. Compliant, yes or no?
No.
Purchasing department, no established criteria for selection and evaluation of suppliers. Not only no, but a big resounding no. Major non-conformance. Production, 3 of 10 micrometers, no evidence of calibration. Compliant? Obviously not. All 3 were personal property to be
It's
used.
exercise 4 for us.
Oh, is it? I'm sorry. Okay. Let me check something.
Yeah, your slide said 2, but it came across with 4.
Yeah, let me check something real quick, because that brings up an interesting question.
What you're reading matches up to what we have here.
For example, right after the true false.
Okay, because I've got 4 non-conforming situations, and I believe I'm just gonna use that in the audit. So the ones, this true false that I've been going over is what you have, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
True false is 1, and then we have exercise 4 is this.
Identification of nonconformities.
Okay.
Nonconformity, yes or no.
Yeah, so let's just go through this real quickly. No way to distinguish between good and bad product, obviously a problem, not good. No training records for the temp. In the facility for 3 months, big problem.
Big problem.
Many of these are major nonconformances.
Yep.
No specific appropriate stages for monitoring, measuring product characteristics. Chapter 7, nonconformance. Obsolete docs are stamped obsolete, filed in the same location as current documents. Not good. Obsolete, yes. Stamped obsolete, yes. Commingled with the current documents, no.
No.
How do we expect people to know which one's in effect? Test reports are maintained for 5 years. Stated retention is 2. Compliant? Yes. You can exceed it. That's okay. No follow-up internal audit non-conformances. fast response to customer orders, sales accepts customer orders, then discusses whether they can. Can we do this after I accepted the order? Remember that section I breezed over pretty quickly, all the customer interaction? Not a good idea. Quality department responsibility product quality, receiving inspects incoming material for damage. This is kind of strangely worded. Quality has responsibility, but not direct. They have oversight. Receiving inspection. So this one's just kind of weirdly. Accounting department personnel not aware of company quality policy. Who's supposed to be aware of the quality policy?
Everybody.
Everybody. Software not validated. I'm sorry, was validated, released, not been revalidated in 2 years.
Depends.
May be good.
Depends on your
If
requirement.
it's unchanged, there's no expectation that you revalidate.
Unless you say you're gonna revalidate it. Well,
There you go. You put in your procedure, we'll revalidate every 2 years regardless of change, then unnecessary, but that's what you said you were gonna do. Final inspection, inspector using a checklist, no form number, not a controlled document.
Not
That's a
good.
problem. New product launch, person received several orders, new parts, new supplier, new technology, no evaluation. Is it the question here, is it a commercial product? If so, rules apply. Production assemblers have been in the company 5 years or more. They receive work assignment verbally, pick the required documentation. We don't need no thinking documentation, major non-conformance. New assemblers not aware of process for handling non-conforming material, not good, major. Final inspection measurement, 0.002 over tolerance. It's critical, that's actually irrelevant.
So,
It's non-conformance, big deal. So, yeah, almost everything on there is a non-conformance. Most of them are major. We're gonna do something very similar to this in the auditing section. Back to this. There we go. All right. 1345 and the QSR. The organization and you individually must be committed to quality. The failure to do that has serious implications, first of all for the company, potentially for you individually, as we talked about. I have seen more than one company gone. The big one was the 700-person pharma company that is no longer in existence. $2 million in fines. Company is gone, 2 criminal prosecutions. They're not fooling around. Create and maintain a certified quality management system. Let's talk about certified very quickly. Regardless of your classification, do you have to be compliant with ISO 13485? The answer is yes. For class 1 products, this is EU, does your quality management system have to be certified? Tricky question. The technical answer is yes, but you don't have to be certified by a notified body. As for a class 1 product, you're allowed to do what's called self-certification. So yeah, you need to be certified to ISO 13485, but you certify yourself. If you're class 2A and up, from that point on, you still must be certified, but you must be certified by a notified body. You are paying them to come in and inspect you. So it depends on what class of product you are. If you are 1 and you wish to have a notified body in your business, be my guest.
But-
It's expensive.
Yeah, but when you do the essential requirements document, a lot of your answers to that are based on certifications and product certifications.
Exactly
So,
right.
Your quality system certification, your product certification helps you tremendously in filling out the essential requirements document.
True. But if you are a class 1 in Europe, you are not required to have a notified body. Your CE mark will look a little bit different. You won't have the 4-digit code on it that identifies TUV in your case. You are perfectly free to bring TUV in. That's, kudos to you.
The live products, we do self-certification ISO 10535
Right.
testing,
Uh-huh.
but that's the only place we do self-certification.
There you go. But technically, as a class 1, you have that option. 2A and up, you have that option. Competitive advantage, I think so. As I've said, it's good business. All these procedures and processes we talked about are good business, regardless of that they're actually required. General questions. It's a lot of information to absorb in one day. Those of you that are going to be here for the auditing will do a lot of this in more detail, because you're actually going to be auditing